It is a great day to be out here celebrating the women's right to vote and women's equality. So, yay! Thank you to our sisters who allowed us to be here today. This is one of our newest historical markers, and our marker program is a small part of what Historic Alexandria does, but it really brings to life the stories, the lesser known stories here in the city of Alexandria. But this gives us a chance to tell these lesser known stories to the residents and the visitors to Alexandria. So it is a small part of what we do, but a major part of promoting Alexandria's histories and part of telling the full story of the history here in Alexandria. And this marker shares the story of the 32 women who were arrested, who were peacefully picketing outside the White House. They endured force feeding and imprisonment at the Occoquan Workhouse, and then they were freed through a ruling by Judge Edmund Waddell on November 27th, 1917, an event that took place here in a building that no longer stands. It's in this parking lot space in a third floor courtroom. So that is the location. That is why this is located where it is. So I'd like to introduce Laura McKie, who's going to give you a deeper dive into the history of suffragists and what these women endured at the Occoquan Workhouse. So help me welcome Laura McKie, the director of the Lucy Burns Museum at today's Workhouse Art Center.
It's really an honor to be here today and to speak about this interesting event that took place here. The Lucy Burns Museum is located at the spot where the women who picketed the White House were imprisoned in 1917. So I hope that you all will voyage out to Lorton, Virginia on some occasion and visit the museum. It's an opportunity to really learn much more about the suffrage movement, as well as learning about the history of DC's prison, which was located in Lorton for 91 years. It's amazing to think that DC had its prison there for 91 years. I'm going to give you just a short background, and then you're going to have an opportunity to meet Mrs. Walker, who's going to tell you a little bit more. As Gretchen said, today is National Women's Equality Day. What is National Women's Equality Day? It was designated by Congress in 1973 to commemorate the day in 1920 when Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby signed the proclamation certifying the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, securing women the right to vote. The last state to approve the amendment, Tennessee, had done so the week before, but it took that long for all the documents to get to Washington. So although last state, Tennessee, had already approved it, nevertheless, it didn't get to Washington until today, or 1920 today. The spot we're standing on today played an important role in the suffrage story, and let me give you a little background. In 1917, after years of effort to secure the right to vote, women had had enough of asking for the right to vote, and they decided to demand that right, and they chose to do so directly in front of President Wilson's home, the White House. Never before had pickets set foot in front of the National Monument, nor had women ever been the unladylike pickets. The members of the National Women's Party were determined to force the President and Congress to change their minds about allowing women the right to vote. A new amendment to the U.S. Constitution was needed. No more going from state to state asking each legislature to allow women to vote. This time, these dedicated sisters were starting at the top in Washington, D.C. In January 1917, after Congress had once again turned aside a motion to create an amendment, women from the National Women's Party walked from their headquarters in Lafayette Square across to the nearby White House bearing banners which said things like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Or, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" In groups ranging from a handful to hundreds, women stood silently for hours in snow, chilly rain, and burning sun. At first, and don't forget, they were wearing clothes like Mrs. Walker is wearing dark clothes, heavy clothes, lots of petticoats. It was hot. At first, President Wilson ignored the pickets. Then as he exited in his motor car, he would politely tip his top hat to the pickets. He even invited some of them to the White House for coffee. They politely declined, saying they were there for the votes, not refreshment. The silent sentinels remained in place whenever Congress was in session through the winter and spring of 1917. Starting in June of that year, however, things changed. The banners that the suffragists carried were becoming more abrasive. Wilson became angered when, after World War II started, he was even called Kaiser Wilson by the pickets. Other pickets banners at that time read, "We, the women in America, tell you that America is not a democracy." And even worse, 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of national enfranchisement. He didn't like it. Wilson then told the commissioners of the District of Columbia to have the women removed. Arrests began. What were the charges? Obstructing free passage of the sidewalk, blocking traffic, and other frivolous citations. Local judges fined the women who refused to pay and gave some of them jail time. Eventually, as the picketing continued and the placards became even more pointed, arrestees were sentenced to DC's Women's Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. During the next 5 months, 72 women served time at the workhouse in Virginia, some for a few days, others for months. It was not a pleasant experience. Although they asked to be regarded as political prisoners, the suffragists were treated like other vagrants, petty thieves, and prostitutes. In November 1917, a group of suffragists who had been protesting their leader, Alice Paul's imprisonment and solitary confinement in the DC jail, were arrested and sent to the Women's Workhouse in Virginia. That was the largest group that was sent to the workhouse. Fortunately, the group's lawyer was able to visit the Lorton prison and observe the prisoners' condition. Discovering that some of the prisoners had gone on hunger strikes and were being force-fed, he searched for a way to get them released. The lawyer was able to serve a writ of habeas corpus on the superintendent of the prison. That forced all the prisoners to be taken to the federal district court in Alexandria, Virginia, and shown to the district judge, Edward Waddell. After seeing the haggard women slump on the seats of the courthouse, barely aware of the proceedings, the judge called their condition blood-curdling and ruled that their transfer to the workhouse was illegal. He ordered that the prisoners must be removed from Virginia and returned to the district. Most of the women would complete their sentences in the district jail. However, The jail was so overcrowded that their sentences were reduced, and they were released within 2 days of their transfer. So, as we have just been told, it was on this very spot that the U.S. Court of the Eastern District of Virginia was here in the Customs House. It was here on November the 25th, 1917, that 30 bedraggled and haggard women were released from the terrors of the loathsome women's workhouse in Lorton. Mrs. Walker, can you tell us a little bit about what actually happened in the prison?
Now, my story is interesting, so I'm going to tell you a bit about that, but I also want to tell you about my very good friend, Dora Lewis, who was part of the crowd that Laura just spoke about. But first, let's get ready and fill our hearts and our passion with the phrase, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Can you join me with that? Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Okay, one more time. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? You're fantastic. Give yourselves a round of applause. You all could be suffragists. And a few of you even have on purple today. So I'll take that as a segue to tell you about the sash that the suffragists wore. It was purple and white and gold. The purple stood for majesty and loyalty, and indeed we were loyal to one another as suffragists. The white represented purity and also the temperance league, which was very, very prominent at the time that the women were picketing for the right to vote. And also the color gold, which reflected the state flower of Kansas, a state in which women once had the right to vote and then lost it. So we like to remember these colors because it keeps us inspired and it keeps us motivated. Well, I'm going to begin by telling you about my experience at Occoquan Workhouse, and then I will segue over to telling you about Dora Lewis because she matches the time frame that you've already heard about from Laura. I was arrested in front of the White House on the 14th of July in 1917 for picketing in front of the White House and supposedly obstructing traffic. We had a choice between a fine of $25 or to serve 60 days in jail. Well, you know what us suffragists did. Of course we went to jail. Of course we went to jail. So let me tell you about the conditions when I first arrived, which were no different than when Dora arrived. We were greeted by a very mean-spirited man named Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker was the superintendent. And by the time I got there in July, he was getting pretty fed up with all these suffragists, these uppity ladies, as we were, because it was really much of America's more wealthy women that had the time and the energy and the wherewithal to go out and picket for the right to vote. So upon our arrival, Mr. Whitaker shouted, "Suffragist, you have no business being a suffragist. My mama ain't no suffragist. We're going to teach you a thing or two here." Well, that didn't exactly feel like a welcome, so we made it our mind to make the best of what we encountered, which included having our clothes taken from us, our jewelry, our glasses, our shoes. We were given coarse prison clothing to wear, ill-fitting shoes, blankets that smelled like vomit and urine, and cells that had small mattresses on them covered in sort of gray, which we thought was mold. Indeed, it was bedbugs. So our welcoming moment was not exactly that. I'll tell you about our food. We were given foul-smelling water and soup that had worms in it. And that is what we were expected to sustain ourselves on. It's no wonder we went on hunger strikes. Well, let me segue to that time in November when the famous Night of Terror happened, November 14th through 15th. Dora Lewis and 40 of her sister suffragists had been picketing that day in front of the White House again and arrested. And their story is not pretty. Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, the two ladies that really were the energy behind everything that we did, from pamphlets to parades. And by the way, I did march in that 1913 parade down Pennsylvania Avenue on the 3rd of March, the day before Wilson's inauguration, the day he expected everyone to meet him at Union Station. However, everybody else was down on Pennsylvania Avenue watching us. So he did not receive much of a welcome either. So we did all these things, parades, pamphlets, meetings. But back to Dora. She was one of my dearest friends. She was arrested on November 10th in front of the White House. And you've heard much of that story already from Laura. It was not pretty. The women were taken to the workhouse and treated just as I had been treated. Only after about 7 days, it was very clear that Lucy and Dora were going to just launch hunger strikes. Within days, they found themselves force-fed, and this is a story that is as gruesome as can be. These women, 4 for Lucy, 5 for Dora, 4 people held Lucy down. 5 held Dora down so that a tube could be placed up their nose and down into their stomach and be force-fed with a mixture of egg yolk and flour. It was gruesome. It was ugly. And I know Dora squirmed and screamed and tried to holler as best she could until she blacked out. Life got even worse than that. When she had been shown her cell, she had been thrown into the cell physically, and her head hit the metal bed. She was knocked out, had a heart attack, and no one came to help. Yes, the suffragists had an attorney, Matthew O'Brien, but he was not allowed to see some of the things that had happened to these women. Well, obviously, they did not want to stay there any longer, and they were concerned about being not treated as political prisoners, but as criminals. And so the court system did what it needed to do, but it took some time. And one of the things that Whitaker did not want was for the public to see how poorly these women looked after having been there for 5, 10, 15 days. And you do know then, by the 25th of November, in this very spot, the women were finally let go. But I want you to remember this story because it is one of many. And at the end of that year, with almost 100 women having been incarcerated that year for having picketed in front of the White House, some served in the DC jail, some served down in Occoquan, they had a wonderful celebration. And also at that celebration was Helen Keller, because she too was a suffragist. And on that night, those of us that had participated were given the prestigious Jailed for Freedom pin. And I wear mine very, very proudly. So understand, women went through so much hardship to make sure we got the right to vote. And we like to say it all began 72 years even earlier, when Abigail Adams said to John, "John, remember the ladies," as the paperwork was drawn up for this new land. And unfortunately, the pronoun was always a he. Had that been different, we would not have had to do what we have done. However, we still have so much work to do. Indeed, we got the right to vote, signed into law on the 26th of August in 1920. But yet only 1/3 of American women could vote because many of them had family members and husbands who did not believe that this was their right. But I do want you to remember this story, because we should never, ever have to fight to be able to vote in this country. No matter our color, no matter our religion, no matter where we live, no matter where we work. That should be a God-given right for all of us. So I charge you as you leave here today to remember some of what I have shared with you, and remember that just as Frederick Douglass had taught us, because he was a great fan of the suffragists, he told us to agitate, agitate, agitate. Remember, if you ever really need to get anything done and make a difference in society, you will need to agitate. Because we never want our sisters, and we never want our daughters, and we never want our mothers to ever have to say again, join me please, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Robert Walker, for sharing that firsthand account with us. We really appreciate your expertise. And we're truly stunned by what these 32 women endured and those who suffered with her for our right to vote today. It just, thank you for helping resonate their story with us. It's my privilege to introduce AP from Senator Warner's office, who's representing both Senator Warner and Congressman Don Beyer today. Thanks for joining us, AP.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. So I'm AP and a very happy Alexandria resident as well. So it's good to see so many of my neighbors here. I'm also the Northern Virginia Outreach Representative for Senator Mark Warner, also an Alexandrian. And I'm so happy to be wearing this sash on Women's Equality Day. But I wanted to acknowledge a couple of things. Our Congressman, Don Beyer, and my colleague in his office, Noah Simon, made a special congressional record entry on this day. And I wanted to show it off a little bit here. Our different congressional records and achievements usually get split up between the offices in that Representative Beyer does all of the congressional records and my boss, Senator Mark Warner, does a lot of letters. And I'm happy to read one from him today. Dear friends, I am pleased to extend my warmest greetings to all who are gathered for the Quiet Sentinel's historic marker dedication. This event provides a moment to reflect on the history of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. In 1917, suffragists exercised their right to assemble by picketing in Washington, D.C. Many of these courageous women were arrested and sentenced to serve prison time at the Occoquan workhouse. They were subjected to terrible conditions and treatment throughout their imprisonment. And thank you, Mrs. Robert Burns, for that very dramatic retelling. Today, we stand at the spot of the former location of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, where they regained their freedom and were ordered to be released. And these women played an important role in the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Our democracy has been made so much stronger by women having the right to vote, and we are in a better place today because of suffragists like the Quiet Sentinels. On this important occasion, I send my best wishes for a successful and fulfilling ceremony. Sincerely, Mark R. Warner, United States Senate.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and perhaps fittingly helping us obstruct the sidewalk and the road this morning. So thank you all. Every time that we broaden the story of Alexandria's history, tell another part of our history that was not told before, we enable more of Alexandrians to see themselves in our history. So, thank you all for being here. About a year ago, we gathered a couple blocks away to recognize the 100th anniversary of the ratification. And we talked about how this important part of this history had occurred right here in our city. This habeas hearing that happened on this site. And, one of the wonderful things about Alexandria is that we can walk our streets and walk in locations where all of these important historical moments happened here. They happened right here. And this is an important chapter, one that led to so much change, that brought this issue to the national consciousness. I always like, as someone who's been in local government for over 10 and a half years, I always like a story where the Wilson is the bad guy, and have to note that. But in this case, the work, the brave work, and self-sacrificing work of these women made change happen in our country. But I think at the same time we recognize this history and the fact that this effort and the ratification of the 19th Amendment helped extend the franchise for some of our women in this country, we also recognize that that progress is not always even and was certainly uneven, and that for many of our women in this country, the franchise would take quite a bit longer to become fully realized. In many cases, the better part of 5 decades to ensure that all women in the Commonwealth and all women in the country had the right to vote. And, you know, in Virginia, we don't like to rush into anything. And so, you know, it's important to note that in the history of Virginia, that while the requisite number of states ratified the amendment to make sure it went into force in 1920, it was not until 1952 that the Commonwealth of Virginia ratified the 19th Amendment, long after it was in effect and long after women were choosing the members of the General Assembly that had the option to ratify the 19th Amendment. It took quite a bit longer until that franchise was formally recognized in the Commonwealth, and then quite a bit longer till it was formally recognized and provided for all women. And so we must note that as we talk about this history. I do have a proclamation to recognize Women's Equality Day, a day and observance that was brought about, as was mentioned earlier, by a pioneering congresswoman in her own right, Bella Abzug of New York, who made sure that that recognition occurred, first proposing it in the early 70s. So, whereas on November 27th, 1917, on the southwest corner of Prince and South St. Asaph, where we are today, in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, the case of American suffragists imprisoned and tortured at the District of Columbia Workhouse at Occoquan was heard. And whereas a few weeks earlier, the women had been peacefully picketing in support of passage of the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution and the right to vote for American women, the suffragists had been arrested outside the gates of the White House in Washington, D.C. on a charge of blocking the sidewalk. The suffragists, many past the age of 60, were sentenced to imprisonment at Occoquan. And whereas at the Occoquan Workhouse on the night of November 14, 1917, referred to as the Night of Terror, the 32 women were subjected to hardships and torture. A number of female prisoners were threatened, chained to their cells, beaten, and hurled against walls, floors, and metal fixtures. The women were denied prompt medical attention. In retaliation against the brutality and rancid food, water, and bedding, several suffragist prisoners initiated a hunger strike. A few days later, violent force feedings began for those suffragists. And whereas bruised, ill, and broken, the suffragist prisoners were brought to Alexandria on November 27, 1917, for a hearing on the 3rd floor of the old Customs House, where U.S. District Court Judge Edmund Waddell, Jr., agreeing the women's treatment had been unduly harsh, ordered the release of the suffragists from Occoquan. And whereas the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, certification of the amendment occurred on August 26, 1920, now known as Women's Equality Day. Whereas on this 101st anniversary of the certification of the 19th Amendment, the city of Alexandria honors the valiant suffragists who endured unspeakable adversity and who, following a landmark federal hearing on this site, continued their courageous national fight for women's equality. And whereas the city of Alexandria holds free and fair elections and promotes equal enfranchisement, the city of Alexandria and the Office of Historic Alexandria and Alexandria Celebrates Women dedicate this historic marker to honor the suffragists who bravely endured imprisonment and torture, and to recognize the site of the federal hearing that freed them from the brutality of Occoquan and enabled many to resume their cause. And whereas the city of Alexandria recognizes that the battles for equality, diversity, and inclusion must continue, seeks to inform all by highlighting with this historic marker the brave women who throughout our history entered our city seeking freedom. Now, therefore, I, Justin M. Wilson, Mayor of the City of Alexandria, Virginia, and on behalf of the Alexandria City Council, do hereby recognize today, August 26, 2021, as Women's Equality Day in the City of Alexandria. And I call this observance to the attention of all of our citizens as a day for us to remember that egalitarianism for all at the ballot box is vital to the survival of our democracy, our nation, and our city. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the City of Alexandria to be affixed this 26th day of August 2021. All right, thank you all so much for being here. At this point, I'm going to invite Pat Miller and Gail Converse to come up to the marker here and unveil this marker that has been the product of so much work on the part of so many. So All right, so 3, 2, 1. Go for it. Yay.